Hello, we are back. I'm Klarenz, and together with my partner Lauren, we are going to discuss the reading Woman's Place in a Man's Life Cycle by Carol Gilligan. Are you guys ready? Let's start. For the first concept found in the reading, we have the observational bias. How is that? The reading opened up with a scene from the second act of The Cherry Orchard. It mentioned that when the observer is a woman, the perspective may be different. Well, I agree with that in a positive manner, for I think women consider many things whenever they set perspective on something, and I think that is really important. After that, the reading proceeded stating that social sciences are rediscovering differences between sexes. Theories that are formerly considered to be sexually neutral are found to be biased towards men's point of view, which is not really surprising, as observational bias is very common given that male life has been considered the norm by many societies. They try to fit women into a masculine cloth. Let's have the Bible as an example, wherein between Adam and Eve, Eve was just deviant for she only came from the ribs of Adam. The Bible perpetuates the idea that men are better than women, not just in the story of Adam and Eve, but into many more events too. An example of this is the context of marriage stated in the Bible, wherein in Ephesians chapter 5 verse 33, the Bible commands wives to respect their husbands. This means revering, admiring, and honoring their husbands. A good wife values her husband's opinions, admires his values and character, and is considerate of his needs, such as the need for self-confidence and the need to be needed. On the other hand, men are obligated to be the leader of the household and to provide for his family, on which women can also do. These contexts of marriage resonates that the role of women are merely to serve their husbands. It devalues their capabilities as a woman. Quote, "A good wife values her husband's opinion." Unquote. What if the opinion is wrong and immoral? Positively, the woman should not value it. I believe that women are strong and capable of leading the household when the husband cannot. To discuss the next part of our reading, which is the development section, let's hear it from Lauren.
Thank you, Clarence. So, as mentioned, the next topic is on development. I will be discussing concepts on the early childhood part of development and the differences between the two sexes. We will be mentioning theories on this section and in the succeeding sections of the reading. We should remember though that most theories in this topic, especially those made in the early to mid 20th century, have observational biases in favor of men. So that's a good thing to keep in mind as we go through the presentation. So let's start with the section on development. Developmental theorists have been portraying a masculine image in their works for a very long time now. And one of the earliest and most prominent examples of this is Sigmund Freud's theory on psychosexual development. It was in 1905 and he built this theory on the experience of a male child, and it culminates in the Oedipus complex. So if you're not familiar with that, he said that Oedipus complex is a phase in a young boy's life when he becomes sexually attracted to his mother and starts to hate and become jealous of his father. The equivalent for this for young girls is the Electra complex, but the Oedipus complex is the more popular concept. In the 1920s, he tried to fit women into this theory. Expectedly, he found contradictions because he was trying to fit the female experience into his theory, which was based on the male experience. But instead of correcting his theory, he proceeds to consider those differences as women's developmental failure. And one of the main differences that he found was regarding morals. He said that for women, the level of what is ethically normal is different from what it is in men. And based on those differences based on that assumption, based on that finding, he proceeds to conclude that women show less sense of justice than men, and that they are more often influenced by feelings of affection or hostility. So in 1974, Chodorow tries to find an explanation for this. She attributed the differences to the fact that women are largely responsible for early childcare. She said that in any given society, feminine personality comes to define itself in relation to other people more than masculine personality does. She also says that gender identity is established by the age of 3 for both sexes, and it rarely changes after that. Gender identity formation in the early stages of life become different because mothers tend to see their daughters as very similar to them, while they see their sons as their opposite. And yung result nito, the daughters are more likely to inherit a sense of attachment in identity formation, whereas the males, the sons, are more likely to separate themselves to establish their masculinity and establish their identity. So in a sense, they form a sense of individualism. They favor individualism over attachment. She was basically countering the male bias in Freud's psychosexual theory. She said that women do not have weaker ego boundaries and instead have a basis of empathy built into their primary definition of self in a way boys do not. And as a result of this concept, then she said that women and men experience issues of dependency differently. For men, daw, separation is critical for development of masculinity, while for women, issues of femininity do not depend on separation or progress of individuation. Male gender identity is also threatened with intimacy, while female gender identity is threatened by separation.
According to the reading, by observing children's games, it can be seen that these games may play a part in child's social development. So, how does it happen? As stated by George Herbert and Jean Piaget, they consider children's games as the crucible or the vessel of a child's social development due to the rules found within the games. To understand this better, let's assess the observations of these people. In the lens of Janet Lever, she observed that boys tend to play outdoors more. They play outdoors with large and age heterogeneous groups. Boys play games that are more competitive, resulting to the duration of these games to be usually longer. Also, Lever said that boys' games are longer for the reason that when conflicts arise, they do not let it stop the play. While when small arguments occur among the girls, they stop the game that they are playing. Hence, Lever observed that boys argue all the time, but they seem to enjoy the debates as much as the games themselves. With that, Lever's observations concluded by stating that legal sense is far less developed in young girls than boys. She said that male development is better since it leads to corporate success, which I think is very relevant today and downright bias. Most traits favored in the business sector like individualism, rigid adherence to rules, direct competition, disassociation from feelings in decision-making, and the likes are traditionally attributed to men. Lever's observation implied that if girls want to be independent, they would have to play like the boys. It's just disheartening to see that for women to be accepted, they have to change their personalities. In addition to Janet Lever's observations are the observations of Lawrence Kohlberg. Based on his observations, he said that moral lessons appear to be fewer in girls' play than in boys due to the nature of the games. For example, patintero. Values such as teamwork and leadership arise in the midst of playing with various people. The boys are then taught to deal with competition with a diverse group of people. In comparison, when girls only play playhouse, making the competition indirect, Kohlberg said that the moral lesson appeared to be less. That's it for the games. Let's now proceed. Bro, take it away.
Okay, so the next topic is on puberty. We'll briefly discuss Freud's take on this stage of life, and we'll introduce another concept, which is Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. But we won't be discussing all of those stages. We will be only focusing on the adolescent stage. Freud's take on puberty. So in this section, there are a lot of quotes lifted from Freud, and we won't be mentioning them all, but these quotes, I think, represent um, how biased his concepts are in favor of men and against women. So for example, he starts by saying, quote, "Puberty, which brings about so great an accession of libido in boys, is marked in girls by a fresh wave of repression." So dito pa lang we can see how different his perspective is towards the male and female puberty. For boys, it's centered around libido only, while for girls, it's centered around repression. And this theme of repression is supported by his other statements. He said that during this stage, a girl accepts, quote, "the fact of her castration," and she becomes aware of, quote, "the wound to her narcissism." So basically, he says that women develop a sense of inferiority in this stage, and we know that puberty is crucial. And in the next slide, we can see how Erikson elaborated this theory. Erikson recognizes the importance of puberty in the development of a human, and I think it's something we all know naman as people in their very late teens or maybe in their very early 20s. We understand how hard it is to go through puberty. We try to define ourselves, we try to find our places in the world, and in a sense, it feels like it's a make and break situation that that stage will set the course for the next stages of your life. So for Erikson, adolescence is the fifth stage of his 8 stages of psychological development. He said that the task at this stage is to form a sense of self, and it is preceded by crises from the 4 stages before it. So the first crisis is trust versus mistrust, followed by autonomy versus shame and doubt, and the next is initiative versus guilt, and the fourth is industry versus inferiority. The fourth stage is basically a stage of imitation. Children learn what their parents do, how their parents do things, in order to be recognized as adults in the society. And the fifth stage again is adolescence. He said that it is a celebration of the autonomous, initiating, and industrious self, and it is the stage of formation of identity. However, there's a major flaw with his concept. He only talks about the male child. So that's very similar to Freud. He said that women discontinues her identity as she prepares to attract a man who will define her. So we should know that this is a very outdated topic, and his reason for this is that intimacy and identity are intertwined for women, while identity precedes intimacy for men. So despite these differences, he refused to change his life cycle chart. Again, this is very similar to what Freud did in his theory. So his life cycle chart remained unchanged. There is little preparation for the intimacy of the first adult stage, and the life cycle is mostly defined by separateness. Again, we didn't discuss those further stages, but the important thing to remember is that it is mostly defined by separateness. And lastly, he said that attachments appear to be developmental impediments, especially for women. So basically, he sees attachment as negative, as something negative. The next section is about the portrayal of male identity versus female identity in fairy tales. The portrayal of men in these types of stories usually start with a struggle, then the man proceeds to conquer the world. The example given in the reading is the story of the 3 languages, wherein a son had a conflict with his father, and the problem is the son is considered helplessly stupid by his father, but he was given one last chance at education. However, all he learned in this is to understand what the dogs bark. Because of this, the father gave up in educating his child and ordered one of his servants to kill his son in the forest. However, the servant refused to do this and just left him there. And throughout his adventure, he stumbled upon a land where furious dogs plague the inhabitants, and the citizens of that place cannot sleep because the dogs won't stop barking, and the dogs from time to time even devour people from that land. And as mentioned, what he learned in that last chance of education was how to talk to dogs, and so he was able to use that to silence them, and this allowed him to restore the peace peace in the land, and this makes him triumphant in his adventure. So that's basically the dynamic with the male characters, and there's a stark contrast when you compare them with female characters. For example, the given example in the reading is Snow White and Sleeping Beauty. They said na Sleeping Beauty and Snow White woke up not to conquer the world but to marry a man. And the reasoning given for this was women's identity is inwardly and interpersonally defined, opposite to a man's. And yung implication nito, yung sinasuggest nito is that adventure is a man's role. If women want to embark in the same journey, she must at least dress like a man and act like a man. So, following fairy tales, we have the discussion about sex as determinant of human behavior. Klarenz will discuss this.
Sex as determinant to human behavior. What exactly is this? On the conclusion formulated by David Mclaren based on the various observations about sex difference, he said that since society is male-centered, male behavior is labeled as the former, while the female behavior is the latter. That basically implies female behavior is often labeled as something deviant from the norm, which is the male behavior. Subjectively, I think this conclusion may not be true. It is just seen as if female behavior is deviant because these observations that David Mclaren concluded are those from the POV of males, especially when the researchers themselves are males. Proceeding, Martina Horner introduced the concept of anxiety of women about competitive achievement motivated by McClelland. On the basis of studies of men, McClelland introduced two logical components of achievement motivation. These are hope success, it is a motive to approach success, and fear failure, the motive to avoid failure. From there, Martina identified another component of achievement motivation, this time derived from the studies of women. This is the fear success, or the motivation to avoid success. It means women are threatened by negative reaction from society when they succeed. She said that this fear exists because for most women, the anticipation of success in competitive achievement activity, especially against men, produces anticipation of certain negative consequences. For example, threat of social rejection and loss of femininity. However, such conflicts regarding success may be viewed in a different light according to Georgia Sasson. She suggested that this fear success might indicate a heightened perception of other side of competitive success, or known as the emotional cost. Also, Sasson pointed that in Horner's statement, anxiety was only present when there's a direct competition. That is when one person thinks that his or her success was gained at the expense of another's failure. Now, through the lens of Virginia Woolf, according to her, the values of women are different than those of men. She said that masculine values prevail in society. As a result of this, women question the normality of their feelings and their judgment. Also, Wolf said that women's sensitivity to the needs of others lead them to attending to voices over their own being. It results to their reluctance to judge. Thus, Wolf concluded that a woman's place to a man's life cycle is primarily to nurture and take care of men. Despite all these, men tend to assume or devalue the care women provide. Immoral men expect women to be their caretakers. As a result, they tend to take their care for granted. On that note, let's now tackle the discrepancy between womanhood and adulthood. Here, values that are deemed necessary for adulthood that are expected of men are considered undesirable for women, such as the ability to autonomously think, the ability to possess clear decision-making, and the ability to do responsible actions. Basically, all the traits that favors individuality over connection to others. The notion that men are better members of society is embedded so deeply in our culture. It limits women because even if they have the following traits early in their life, it is often forced out of them to fit the ideal woman, the woman who is demure and reserved. We are now nearing the end of the discussion. Before that, let's talk about justice. Is it really justice? Laren, will you please discuss this part and your insights about it?
Thank you, Clarence. So the next part of our discussion is on women's sense of justice. The idea that the sense of justice of women is inferior to that of men originated in Freud, and it reappeared in the works of Piaget and Kohlberg in the years after Freud mentioned that. So in a way, they supported that idea and they helped perpetuate that idea. Studies and theories done by these two scientists exclusively used boys as subjects. The child was assumed to be male. So they didn't even bother to use female subjects to construct these theories, and it's an obvious bias in favor of men. So with this in mind, it won't be fair to define the inferiority or superiority of one sex over the other, because there's no basis in the first place, and it lacks the point of view of the development of morality among women. So Kohlberg and Kramer had another outdated and an idea that I don't support, because they said that only when women engage in activities that are traditionally masculine will they realize the inadequacy of their moral perspective. So again, they automatically assume that men's moral perspective is the right one, and they assume that it is the best one without even considering the moral perspective of women in their studies. They also said that this will allow them to progress to higher levels of justice. Again, it is unfair because they criticize women for not fitting into their theories na hindi naman sila sinali in the first place. So they don't have the right to criticize them for not fitting into those theories. And because of this, a paradox forms. The traits that define a, quote, good woman mark them as deficient in moral development. The concept of maturity, again, is derived from the study of men's lives. So again, walang say yung women on these studies, but they are marked as deficient in moral development. Kohlberg conducted a study regarding morality, and this was one man's response when he asked the question, what does morality mean to you? So if you read that, basically he says that nobody knows the answer, and that morality is recognizing others' rights and not interfering with those rights. He said that it is acting as fairly as possible. So from that answer, we can assume that this man's sense of morality is pretty straightforward. The most important thing for him was the individual right. So there's this sense of individualism, and we'll see on the next slide how it compares with a woman's perspective on morality. So the text you can see in this slide is part of the transcript of a woman's response when asked a similar question. So the question is there really some correct solution to moral problems, or is everybody's opinion equally right? So basically, she said that no one knows, there's no one answer to what morality is. But she also proceeds to say that opinions are not always right. She takes into account its effects to other people, and that's the main difference when compared to the man's response. The man's response was straightforward. You can do whatever you want as long as it's within your rights. While her response was, there's a right and wrong answer, and that depends on the effect of other people. So in a sense, the main difference between the two is that the woman gives importance to coexistence, while the man gives importance to individualism. This next section is about the myth of Demeter and Persephone, and Mclaren's take on the myth. So this myth is about the Greek goddess of agriculture, Demeter, and her daughter Persephone. So the story goes, Persephone was playing in a field and admiring a narcissus flower when suddenly the ground parted and Hades appeared to abduct her into the underworld. Demeter mourned the loss of her daughter. So during this mourning, she refused to let crops grow as the goddess of agriculture, and a famine ensued. This is when Zeus, the king of the gods, decided to interfere. He persuaded Hades to let Persephone go and live in the world of the living, and he was successful in that. He was able to convince Hades to let Persephone go. However, before she leaves, she eats some pomegranate seeds, and the concept is that when you eat anything from the underworld, you have to spend part of every year in the underworld, and that's what happened to Persephone. They say that for 6 months she is with Hades, and for the other 6 months she is in the world of living with her mother. And the ancient Greeks used this to explain the seasons. They say that when Persephone is with Hades, the crops refuse to grow, and when Demeter and Persephone are happily together, the crops start to grow again. So Mclaren's take on this was, it demonstrates the feminine attitude towards power. Again, there's this value of coexistence, because when Demeter reached that breaking point, the coexistence was severely damaged. And Mclaren said that it is a special representation of feminine psychology. So that's his take on the myth of Demeter and Persephone. So we are now at the last part of our report. To state the conclusion, we have Klarenz.
To conclude our report, Carol Gilligan stated that a woman's place in a man's life cycle is to protect the recognition of the continuing importance of attachment in the human life cycle, while the developmental litany intones the celebration of separation, autonomy, individuation, and natural rights. She said that life cycle theorists should give as much attention to women as they do to men to encompass the experiences of both sexes and make their theories more fertile. It is important to take into account the experiences of women, and if it happens, the theories will be so much more universal, comprehensive, and accurate. That's it! We hope you enjoyed the discussion. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me or my partner. We look forward to see you soon. Bye-bye.